fundamental or the uh, need aspect which we started, which we were doing.
Okay, sir. Good
So
morning.
there's good morning.
Good morning,
So
sir.
good morning. So that's
Good
we were
morning,
looking
sir.
at. Very good morning to everyone. So need for preservation, conservation, and protection of environment we were looking. So in terms of forest aspect, we had discussed the conservational aspects of forest, how we are conserving it. So another aspect here is intensive plantation. Just a second.
What, sir?
Intensive plantation. So, in intensive plantation, basically, it's about all planting all the available land from villages, fields to common land, road, rail sites, and every available space that is there. So, indigenous and exotic
Sir, please
species can
little
be.
louder, sir.
Yeah. So we can have basically exotic species and indigenous species used for plantation so as to remove pressure on natural forests. The National Afforestation and Eco Development Board, NEAB of the Government of India, has taken up a massive plantation in many districts, about 50 districts every year since the year of 1992 and 93. That is basically the initiative and effort with respect to intensive plantation. And production captive plantation, if we see, it involves intensive plantation of trees on available land or on land not under agriculture with the aim of fulfilling the commercial demand. So generally, fast-growing trees such as eucalyptus, acacia, etc., are raised using modern techniques, and the production forestry programs include social forestry, agroforestry, and urban forestry programs under community forestry. And here we see social forestry. If we see social forestry started with NCA in 1976, involves raising of trees for firewood, fodder, agricultural implements, and fruits on public and common lands, roadsides, etc. This is for the benefit of rural community by involving villages and school children. The area under social forestry increased from 15 mega hectares in first plan to 2,508 in the year 2000. And agroforestry is a new name for an ancient land practice where land is used for agriculture, forestry, and animal husbandry. It is, however, a recent scientific activity. Depending upon the situation, we may also have a mix of three basic elements: agriculture, forestry, and animal husbandry. So, according to International Council for Research in Agroforestry (ICRAF), agroforestry is a system of land use where woody perennials are deliberately used on the same land management units as annual agricultural crops and or animals, either sequentially or simultaneously, with the aim of obtaining greater outputs on a sustained basis. So that is agroforestry. And coming to urban forestry, it is aimed at growing ornamental and fruit trees in urban areas along sides of roads, in private compounds, vacant lands, and common parks, so as to protect environment. So this is all about forest conservation. Now, coming to conservation of water. Okay, so considering how little water is actually available for use, conservation of water and efficient management of water sources are more critical than ever before compared to earlier times. Now, the need for water conservation has become much more intensive and crucial. So we'll see certain approaches or methods followed for conservation of water. Firstly, water harvesting. So water harvesting means deliberate collection and storage of rainwater that runs off on natural or man-made catchment areas. Catchments include rooftops, compounds, rocky surfaces, or hill slopes, or artificially prepared impervious land surfaces. The amount of water harvested depends on the frequency and intensity of rainfall, catchment characteristics, water demand, and how much runoff occurs. So, rainwater harvesting is neither energy and intensive nor labor intensive. India has an enormous amount of water that can be captured directly as rainfall or as runoff from small catchments. Just a sec. So, if even if 15% of total runoff can be captured directly through rainwater harvesting, tremendous pressure can be taken off the country's groundwater and surface water resources, and the availability of clean water can be greatly extended. So, Johats, if we see, Johad is a method of conservation of water by constructing earth pond or check dam to conserve rainwater. In Rajasthan, today there are more than 4,000 Johats, Johats, by using traditional systems and knowledge, and they are totally managed by the community. No qualified engineer has been involved in their construction. Starting with the site selection, design, and execution, they have been managed by certain individuals called Gajdars or traditional rural engineers. The Johats stood for the tests of intensive rainfall, floods, etc. And Kunz also, KUNDS, Kunz, in many parts of Rajasthan, an ingenious system of rainwater harvesting known as Kunz or Kundis, KUNDS or KUNDIS. So these are terms interchangeably used. These have evolved over centuries. The Kund is an underground tank developed for drinking water. The Kund consists of a saucer-shaped catchment area with a gentle slope towards the center where a tank is situated. So openings or inlets for water to go into the tanks are usually guarded by a wire mesh to prevent the entry of floating debris, birds and reptiles. So they are kept off uh, through this, and the top is usually covered with a lid where water can be drawn out with a bucket. So this is Kunz, and coming to Tankas, TANKAS. So in Gujarat, the houses have water storage tanks called tankas. Okay, so basically they are tanks. They are called as tankas. So rainwater from the roof is drained during the monsoon months and diverted to these underground tankas. So water from these tankas is then used in the summer months when there is scarcity of water. And also, there's something called temple ponds. In South India, ponds or tanks were built in temple compounds to store water. During the water scarce season, water from these tanks was utilized by the community. So basically, it was majorly near temples. So that's why they are temple ponds. So these are traditional conservation methods that we have seen. These have been taken up at many places like Ovile near Pondicherry and certain many other places. Tarun Bharat sung at Alwar in Rajasthan and Ralegaon Siddhi under the leadership of Anna Hazare in Maharashtra, Rajiv Gandhi National Drinking Water Mission in Madhya Pradesh, Gram Gaurav Paristhan in Maharashtra, and the construction of watersheds in South India have been taken up for water conservation on a large scale. So the government prepared the National River Conservation Plan (NRCP), the National Lake Conservation Plan, watershed management programs, and implementing them in letter and spirit. And for the sake of sustainable water conservation, if we see construction of dams and water reservoirs to control water floods, ensure year-round supply of water, and generation of electricity, and building of small reservoirs wherever possible. This is also sustainable water conservation. Developing small catchment dams and protecting wetlands, diversion of water bodies through canals to increase water supply in drier areas, regular dredging and desalination of rivers, streams, and other water bodies, and recycling of used water in industries so as to reduce water wastage, using drip irrigation in agriculture, and reduction in domestic water use wastage, preventing leakages from dams and canals, preventing loss in municipal pipes, pricing water at its real value makes people use it more responsibly and efficiently and reduces
Wastage of water. Sir, your voice is not audible, sir. Santosh, sir, your voice is not audible. Voice not audible, sir.
I'm back now. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir, it's audible now.
Yes, sir, it's audible now. Yeah, it got disconnected, the computer problem. So in deforested areas where land has
We were speaking about the
we were
pricing of
speaking
water,
about the
sir.
pricing of water. Yeah, the pricing of water, real value makes people, more responsible, and because of that, there's efficiently they use the water, and this reduces the wastage.
Yes, sir.
Yes. And in deforested areas where land has been degraded, soil management by making bunds along the hill shapes, hill slopes, and making nala plugs, and also this can help moisture and make it possible to uh, for revocated degraded areas. It is always better to leave the rivers and water flows to follow their course as undisturbed as possible. So this is with respect to water conservation. Coming to conservation of minerals. So we can take certain steps which would be useful to conserve the minerals. So we'll see what those steps are. Firstly, increasing the efficiency of mineral production. So all this is for conservation of minerals. So firstly, in efficiency of mineral production has to be increased. Then reducing non-essential mineral use, and also making fullest use of the very recyclable properties of metals, and use of minerals as raw material should be restricted to industries producing essential materials only. Okay. So also new technologies should be adopted in the industries using minerals so that the wastage can be checked. There can be a check on the wastage. The untapped mineral deposits of minerals in seabeds should be exploited, and proper substitutes should be found for minerals. Example, plastic wares in place of metallic containers, copper zinc, nickel alloy in place of silver in coins, glass, plastics, ceramics, and synthetic fibers in place of exhaustible minerals. And the manufacturing industries may use the waste products of one manufacturing process as the raw material for another industry. So whatever is coming out as waste products of one industry, that can be to the extent possible made as raw material for another industry. The limited stock of minerals, once exhausted, cannot be replenished. Hence, they have to be used economically and be substituted by the use of more abundant minerals in place of scarce minerals, keeping in mind the environmental implications. So, this is with respect to conservation of minerals. Now, we'll see conservation of biodiversity. So the meaning of conservation of biodiversity, firstly, so conservation of biodiversity means the management of human use of the biosphere so that it may give maximum benefit to the present generation while maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of the future generations. So, in biodiversity conservation, we study how human activities affect the diversity of plants and animals and develop ways of protecting that diversity. Conservation ranges from protecting the populations of a specific species to preserving entire ecosystems. The most effective and efficient mechanism for conserving biodiversity is to prevent further destruction or degradation of habitats by humankinds. So this is basically with respect to conservation of the biodiversity. And with respect to conservation of wildlife, wildlife is a component of biodiversity. So, to a common man, the term wildlife means the wild, undomesticated animals living in their natural habitats, like forests, deserts, grasslands, and such other places. However, an ecologist includes both the naturally occurring animals, fauna, as well as plants, flora, in wildlife. Conservation of wildlife means the management of human use of the biosphere so that it may give maximum benefit to present generation while maintaining its potential to meet the requirements of the future generations. Objectives of conservation of wildlife, if we see, basically, it is to maintain essential ecological processes and life supporting systems, air, water, soil, and to preserve the diversity of species or the range of genetic material found in the world's organisms. And lastly, to ensure a continuous use of species and ecosystems which support rural communities and major industries. The conservation of living resources is concerned with the living organisms, that is, plants, animals, and microorganisms, and with those non living elements of the environment which support them. So, now we'll see the conservation strategies, which are like the steps to be taken to conserve India's biodiversity. So there are two basic approaches uh, to this conservation. One is called in situ, and the other one is called ex situ. In situ means on site, and ex situ means off site. So these are two aspects of conservation. So in situ conservation, conservation or protection of flora and fauna within natural habitat is called in situ conservation preservation. In situ conservation, as defined by the United Nations Environment Program, which is popularly known as through its abbreviation UNEP, okay, United Nations Environment Program, is the conservation of ecosystems and natural habitats and the maintenance and recovery of viable populations of species in their natural surroundings. So, in situ conservation includes conservation of plants and animals in their native ecosystems or even in man made ecosystems. This type of conservation applies only to wild fauna and flora and not to the domesticated animals and plants because conservation is achieved by protection of populations in nature. In general, in situ conservation is more cost effective. India has taken several steps towards in situ conservation of biodiversity, such as protected areas, biosphere reserves, sacred forests, and sacred lakes. So this is important aspect of in situ conservation. And if we see the protected areas, India's major attempt to conserve in situ wildlife biodiversity has been through a network of protected areas throughout the nation. Protected areas are areas of land and or sea, especially dedicated to the protection and maintenance of biological diversity and of natural and associated cultural resources. Two kinds of protected areas are recognized by the legal system in India: natural parks and wildlife sanctuaries. So if we see by the year 2004, India had 589 protected areas, of which 89 are national parks, 500 wildlife sanctuaries, okay, uh, occupying 156,000 square kilometers, or over 5% of country's area, as against 10% internationally suggested norm. So the internationally suggested norm is 10%. However, in India, we are able to do 5%. So the protected areas provide certain benefits. What are those benefits? We'll see. Basically, one of the benefit is maintain viable population of all native species and subspecies. So whatever are native species for India, they are able, and also subspecies also, we can maintain them. Okay. And next is maintain the number and distribution of communities and habitats, and conserve the genetic diversity of all the present species, and prevent man-made introduction of alien species, and make it possible for species or habitats to shift in response to environmental changes. And after protected areas, one more aspect is national parks. So a national park is an area which is strictly reserved for the welfare of wildlife, and where activities such as forestry, grazing or cultivation are not allowed. So private ownership right and habitat manipulation are not permitted in national park. The first initiative was the establishment of the Jim Corbett National Park near Nainital in the year 1936. So this is all with respect to in situ conservation. Now we come to ex situ conservation. So ex situ conservation means the flora and fauna are preserved outside natural habitats in a carefully controlled situation. In ex situ conservation, the species are conserved away from the natural habitats under artificially managed conditions. As per Guldagar, the objectives of ex situ conservation, if we see, basically it is to establish and maintain conservation stands characterized as far as possible by the same genotype frequencies as the original populations. Also, another objective is to establish and maintain conservation stands characterized as far as possible same gene frequencies as the original populations, thus avoiding total loss of any static conservation of gene pool. So basically, it is also to establish conservation stands in which gene frequencies are allowed to change freely according to natural selective forces, evolutionary conservation, and also to establish conservation stands in which gene frequencies are deliberately changed by man in order to conserve characteristics important for plantation economy in a region, and at the same time eliminate undesirable characteristics, selective conservation. Flora and fauna are preserved as herbarium specimens. Okay. Seed storage at low temperature at gene banks, botanical gardens, zoos, deer parks, safari parks, aquaria, research institutes, etc. So microbes are preserved as cultures on agar media through lyophilization. Lyophilization.
What about our ITF class? The last class we had on Saturday, I believe, you attended the class. Mr. Tarun.
There are botanical gardens. So Field gene banks are other ways of preservation of genetic resources. These field gene banks preserve genetic resources under normal growing conditions. Botanical gardens are the most common places for conservation of biodiversity. So, all over the world, there are more than 1500 botanical gardens, and they contain more than 80,000 species of plants. Arboreta are botanical gardens where specific tree and shrub species are cultivated. Many of these botanical gardens have seed banks, tissue culture facilities, and other ex situ technologies. There are over 1600 botanical gardens in the world, holding about 4 million plants. They cover about 80,000 species, or 30% of all known species. The largest one is Kew Gardens in England, which has 25,000 species. And in India, a number of orchid sanctuaries and orchidariums have been established in orchid rich habitats like the foothills of the Himalayas, the Western Ghats, the Western coastal region, and the southern hill stations. There are 35 botanical gardens in India. So, in India, the National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resources in New Delhi is engaged in conservation of plant biodiversity. Zoos. So, when an animal is on the brink of extinction, it must be carefully bred so that inbreeding does not lead to genetic composition becoming weak. Breeding from the same stock can lead to poorly adapted progeny.
I, I mentioned I think after asking you this. Okay.
Or even on an inability to beget enough offspring. So, for conservation of animals, techniques like artificial insemination and embryo transfer can be utilized in multiplication of endangered species. Modern breeding programs are done in zoos that provide for all the animals' needs, including enclosures that stimulate their wild habitats. There may also be a need to assist breeding artificially. So there are more than 800 zoos around the world. These zoos are professionally managed and are harbored by about 3,000 species of mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. So well-developed captive breeding programs are carried out in many of these zoos. In India, successful ex situ conservation programs have been done for all our three species of crocodiles. This has been highly successful. The most successful example is the Madras Crocodile Trust Bank, which has grown from 10 to 8,035 crocodiles, and the crocodiles here lay two clutches of eggs a year compared to one in the wild. Another recent success has been the breeding of very rare pygmy hawk in the Guwahati Zoo under the Pygmy Hawk Conservation Program. The Delhi Zoo has successfully bred the rare Manipur Bro antlered deer. In India, there are 275 zoos, deer parks, safari parks, and aquaria. The National Bureau of Animal Genetic Resources, Karnal, has been engaged in conservation of animals.
The question is, there are some things allowed by law, regulated by law, provisioned by law, in a general or real
And coming to the biodiversity conservation in India through law or legislation, we'll see what are the various statutes or acts and laws that have been put forth for conservation of biodiversity in India. Okay.
Yes.
Firstly, the Madras Wild Elephant Preservation Act 1873.
These are the
So,
wrong lands.
way back in 1873 itself, for the sake of elephant preservation, there was a Madras Wild Elephant Preservation Act, okay, in 1873. Then, All India Elephant Preservation Act in 1879.
Yes.
Then came the Fisheries Act 1897, which prohibits the use of explosives and poisons for fishing.
Please speak up. Please speak up.
Then the Wild Birds and Animal Protection Act in 1912.
Yes.
The Forest Act 1927, which deals with the setting up and management of reserved, protected and village forests and controls how selected products from the forest can be sold and at what price. Next, Bengal Rhinoceros Preservation Act 1932. Okay. In 1954, Assam Rhinoceros Preservation Act. And later, the Wildlife Protection Act in 1972, the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1991, the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 2002, deal with the restriction and prohibition of hunting of animals and with the protection of specified plants.
Okay.
The Forest Preservation, the Forest Conservation Act 1980 primarily focused on prohibiting or regulating non-forest use of forest lands. Then the Biodiversity Act 2002, which provides for a National Biodiversity Authority, will screen proposals for transfer of genetic resources abroad. Then the establishment of Indian Board for Wildlife 1952. Then establishment of national parks, sanctuaries and zoological gardens. And Indian National Man and Biosphere Committee 1972 for Biosphere Reserve. Then Project Conserve Individual Endangered Species like crocodile in 1954, lion in 1972 and tiger in 1973. These are the Project Conserve Individual Endangered Species. Then National Wildlife Action Plan 1982, endorsed by IBWL, and lastly India became a party to CITES, Conservation of International Trade in Endangered Species of wild flora and fauna in the year 1976. So these are the major aspects with respect to the law or legislation for conserving biodiversity. So with this we finish the need for preservation, conservation and protection of environment. So we'll take the next topic in the next session tomorrow.
Sir, do you suggest any good book for the environmental law?
The suggested readings are there. If you see in the syllabus, Maheshwar Swami is there, Leela Krishnan is there, Manoj Kumar. You can go for a book which covers the syllabus, which is S.R. Maineni.
S.R. Maineni.
Yes.
Okay, so that is as per the OU syllabus for environmental law.
No, the suggested readings from OU are different authors, but the syllabus, if you see, it is covered in S.R. Maineni.
Okay.
In a approachable manner and convenient manner.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Sure. Thank you.
Okay, so that's it for today's session. The next session will start in 2-3 minutes. Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
You are talking about power of attorney.
Okay.
Power of attorney is not allowed